Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lawrence Sherman. I'm a professor at the University of Cambridge, and I want to give you due warning in the spirit of procedurally fair policing that this session is being videotaped and that anything you say is being recorded. Therefore, I assume you will speak with all of your usual wisdom and discretion, as in any other public event. I work at a university. I come here not to praise universities, but to bury them. The idea that police should be connected with universities is one that I've been working on for most of my adult life. But what I have found as I get older is that the idea depends very heavily not on where police are being taught things, but what they are being taught and the content of police education and training. I think is far more important than what has recently been occupying the police in Scandinavia. You may know that in Denmark, for example, they went through years of discussion, decided to create a university degree equivalency for a bachelor's degree in policing as the basis of the National Police School. Having set all that up, we had a migration crisis and they canceled the whole program. So it's back to where it was with a much shorter training period and, shall we say, dealing with the continuing reality of policing, which is that you have to cope with the problems at hand. Here in Sweden, where I think most of you are from, we have similar discussions going on. And in an earlier session on the content of evidence-based policing as a subject for police education, there was, I think, a very important question put by a member of the audience. It was last November. It was right across the hall on the other side of the building. And I was doing my job of talking about the curriculum that we teach at the University of Cambridge in relation to evidence-based policing, which is also taught in other venues, in other ways around the world. But here we are in Europe. We have a history of police coming from Sweden to study in this part-time program at Cambridge. Just this year, Denmark, with the support of a private foundation, has decided to send 12 members of the Danish politi to this part-time program at Cambridge every year. And the question was raised in Denmark, as it was here in Sweden last November. Why Cambridge? Why not other institutions that are in Denmark? And I think the answer, and my reference to the Julius Caesar text, I think the answer is that historically, since the 1960s, when I first began doing police research, the view of the universities has been that their job is to criticize the police, is to point out things that are wrong and that need to be fixed. And certainly since the Ferguson shooting in the United States in summer of 2014, today's New York Times reports Canada is now seized with the same issue with the North American prevalence of guns and gangs and other things. There's a continuing and very vital tradition of criticizing the police. I think the dialogue in the United States that's going on right now is essentially, why can't the American police be more like the Swedish police, or the Danish police, or the British police? And we frequently cite the comparison between over 1,000 people a year shot to death by the American police in a same year where 60 million British people, thousands of armed incidents confronting the police, nobody gets killed. Maybe once every 2 or 3 years in Britain does somebody get killed. So what is it about a philosophy of policing, the way in which policing is taught, the way in which policing is done, that might explain that? And I think that's where we get into the spirit of problem solving, of using research the same way doctors use research to figure out how to save lives and how to work together. The universities don't go out and attack doctors, say, oh, you doctors are all bad, you don't like, poor people or whatever. It may be true. In fact, there has been some research showing there's certain biases in availability of treatments, not only by race or ethnicity, but also by age. But I think to open this session with a strong affirmation that there is a clear distinction between universities that approach the question of policing as a purely disinterested question, as an object of study. How do we understand the police as a phenomenon? Which is a very valid, very important way to approach policing. But it's not the only way. And you can study law in that way, but you can also study law as a professional. You can study the basic science of biology in relation to medical applications, and you can also teach how to practice medicine. What we're about today, in the next several hours here, is trying to explain to some of you who have already heard this, the fundamentals to those of you who haven't, so that there can be a discussion not only here in Sweden, but indeed in any country in the world that wants to have this conversation, and increasingly many of them are. The Swedish National Council of Crime Prevention has very kindly arranged for the competent gentleman in the rear of the room to videotape and record this session, as I mentioned at the outset, so that I'm hoping that this dialogue, no matter what you have to say, and if you want to come back to the why all the eggs in not only a Cambridge basket, but an evidence-based policing basket. Why aren't there other ways, qualitative methods, ethnographic appreciation of the experience of people in police encounters? Why should we only study policing through the lens of evidence-based policing? And that's a kind of dialogue I would welcome, because I would be the last to say we should only study it this way, but I would be the first to say that this is the best way to introduce research from social science in many disciplines, not just criminology, but also psychology and organizational sociology and so forth. Introducing research to policing in a practical way for people who are already practicing police officers just has a much better history of success. When I was teaching in undergraduate or even graduate programs with police officers in the room, they were never very impressed with how useful the basic research we were doing back in the 70s and the 80s was. But since I came to Cambridge in 2007 in a program that was originally created at the request of the British police to prepare chief constables to become the leaders of the 43 police forces in England and Wales, repeatedly, police have come to me and said, I have been a police officer for 15 years, and nobody ever taught me about all this research on what works in policing and what doesn't work. Why didn't somebody tell me that when I first started in policing? Now that, I think, those are the sweetest words I've ever heard. I heard some nice sweet word last night, but those words are even sweeter. And to have police tell us that this is important is the reason that we have been growing actually 10 times in size since 10 years ago. And the Hong Kong police have now approached us. We're going to open a second theater in the Pacific where the Hong Kong Police College will host police from around East Asia to do half of their program there and then come to Cambridge for the other half. It's all going to be taught by Cambridge academics going to Hong Kong to deliver the program. But it's one example of how we're trying to spread it. So, enough of the introduction. What is evidence-based policing? It is a social movement of police officers who are trying to apply research to improve policing. The first Society of Evidence-Based Policing was founded by Alex Murray, who proposed to his senior officers as a young inspector that they start undertaking experiments to improve policing in the second largest police force in England. It was taken up by Chief Constable Sarah Thornton, who is now head of all the chief constables in UK. It's been adopted to try to deal with a horrendous homicide rate in Trinidad and Tobago by their current four-year commissioner, Stephen Williams. And since 2010, this membership organization, consisting mostly of police officers, has now enrolled 35 countries with over 2,000 members, and then other places like Australia and New Zealand creating their own societies of evidence-based policing, who do what learned societies do. They come together and they talk about research. They ask questions about what works, what's more important, how do we figure out how we're doing a better job, and not only listening to professors, but police officers who are doing the research. And we're about to found the Cambridge Journal of Evidence-Based Policing, which will consist mostly of shortened versions of the master's theses that the master students do at Cambridge in the second year. We also have people coming there from Australia who are part of this society, but who are doing their thesis research in Australia, and we hope to publish it in our Cambridge Journal. Canada has just founded a Society of Evidence-Based Policing. The United States has just founded a Society of Evidence-Based Policing. And the Swedish Police Authority is engaged in discussions, even as we speak, about how to connect knowledge to policing in a way that will strengthen the resilience of a police force that I would say, as a disinterested observer, is suffering the same thing that the Scottish police and other police forces I'm familiar with suffer when they go through a massive reorganization and restructure the organization in a relatively short period of time. The evidence suggests that that is very distracting from doing the business at hand, that you're too worried about where the walls and the roof are going in the new structure to be focusing on what is the most immediate problem and the best solutions. So just to distract you a bit from all of this abstract stuff, I would just show you something that was produced by a police officer from Durham, England, who had just spent 1 year at the Cambridge program. This tells you absolutely nothing about evidence-based policing, but it should distract you. Well, with thanks to Sheena Irwin of the Durham Constabulary. As I say, some of you have been to Cambridge, and those of you who have would testify it is a lot of work, but it certainly is a at least 16-hour-a-day United Nations of policing combined with, shall we say, a fairly festive atmosphere, especially in the summer term. And all of that tends to enhance the learning. But I would be the first to say that the price of residential education at the #1 research university with more Nobel Prizes than any other in the world is not a realistic model for an entire police force. What we would prefer is to have the content of what is being taught at Cambridge fed into national police professions and services through people who have been to Cambridge and who have deeper understanding and can help convey a more summary version, a digested version. And what I'd like to do now is to show you an example of a video recording that could be shown in any police station in Sweden where they agree to stay late for a half hour, come in early a half hour, or maybe even over lunch, with somebody who may have been to Cambridge, maybe an academic who is interested in evidence-based policing. The question I would ask, and I'll ask for comments as soon as we finish the video, comments from people who would like to be discussion leaders with people who haven't heard of evidence-based policing before. Does this do the job? Is this going to give you the raw material to open a discussion that will interest operational police officers rather than turn them off? We want to ask you, does this do the job to open the minds as opposed to closing the minds? So let's see what you think about the overview of the basic ideas for operational evidence-based policing, which should begin.
These wheels keep on turning, proud Mary keep on burning, rolling, rolling, rolling on the river, rolling.
My name is Heather Strang.
My name is Lawrence Sherman, and this is Chapter 5, Evidence and Continuous Improvement, the 3 T's.
So what are these 3 T's that Chapter 5 is all about?
Targeting, testing, and tracking. Those 3 T's make up the core of evidence-based police decision-making.
And why are these 3 decisions so important?
They're the keys to performance. They help police set objectives, improve the methods of meeting those objectives, and increasing the capacity to deliver those methods of meeting those objectives.
And is this true of other organizations besides the police?
Absolutely. You see this pattern of the 3 T's in politics, in sports, in public health. At the business school at Carnegie Mellon University, the Center for Evidence-Based Management is talking about the 3 T's as being really vital to improving profitability of businesses. And Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, said an important thing about the 3 T's, which is deciding what not to do is as important as deciding what to do, which is really the essence of targeting that is informed also by how well you can do whatever you're trying to do. And that's exactly what the presidential elections have been about in both the Clinton years and President Obama. They both won 2 elections, and they both did it by a very evidence-based approach to targeting the swing states that would make the most difference, and not putting any money in the states that weren't going to vote for them no matter what, and really not putting much money in the states that were going to vote for them, just trying to leverage with a real focus where their money, their time would make the most difference. And other candidates who tried to cover the whole country and weren't that focused haven't been winning those elections.
So how does the Triple T work for evidence-based policing?
Well, for each of these 3 T's, there are 3 key components that anybody who's practicing evidence-based policing would want to understand and probably memorize. For targeting, you have to look for the power few, you have to make good predictions, and you need to practice triage. For testing, you need to understand what a good sample is, what a good comparison is, and how to maintain that with integrity. For tracking, you need to measure what the police are doing in a consistent and fair way. You need to feed back to the police officers what they're doing, and if they're still not doing it as much or as well as they should be, then taking the tough decisions to correct the situation. So for each of these 3 T's, these 3 ideas have to become kind of automatic and skillful, but you get skillful by practicing each of these things that we'll try to explain right now.
So let's take targeting first.
Targeting, to find the power few, to make predictions and practice triage, I think it begins with the question of how much butter you have to put on your bread.
So is every police service spread too thinly?
It sure looks like they all have way too many crimes and too few officers in cars to deal with them all, and they've all got problems in deciding which tasks are the most important. And they get swayed by political and media pressures, but that's not necessarily in the best public interest. And that's where this idea of using evidence to find the power few is something police might be able to put back into the political discourse about why they're doing one thing and not others, why they're choosing some targets and not others.
So tell us some more about this idea of the power few.
This is an economist from the 20th century, Vilfredo Pareto, who inspired this thing called the 80-20 rule, that 80% of the result comes from 20% of the people or investment. So that's in business. In policing, we see even more concentration of the crime among a few offenders or a few places where the crimes occur. And once you identify this power few, where you get the greatest potential to change the whole problem in a small percentage of the entire population that has the problem, you've got this opportunity to make much more out of each person, each hour of police time, each investigation. No matter what police resource you're using, you're going to get more out of it when you're aiming at the bigger bullseye and not at the very thin margins around the outer circles.
So can you give us some more specific examples relating to policing and crime?
Well, for example, in a famous study in Philadelphia, 17% of the offenders yielded 50% of the arrests. If you take one of those offenders out of circulation and they're repeatedly committing crimes, presumably that would make fewer crimes happen than if you're arresting somebody and putting a lot of effort into locking him up if he's one of the most typical offenders who gets caught once and never does anything again. So if you put energy into cases in which there really wasn't much risk of harm to the community, that's a wasted effort compared to putting that effort into the power few. Mm-hmm. That's with offenders. Also with addresses, we found in Minneapolis, 3% of the addresses yielded 50% of the calls to the police. If you want to reduce calls to the police, focus not on 100% of the addresses, focus on 3% of the addresses. In Washington, a study on arrests leading to convictions with sufficient evidence to get the prosecutor to take the case and take it through to conviction. 15% of the police officers were producing 50% of the convictions because they did that better than the other police officers. And on a less salubrious note, it was less than 1% of the police officers in the Los Angeles Police Department around the time of the Rodney King beating, illegal and videotaped in public, the first of many such illegal acts to be videotaped and become world famous. In that case, the commission investigating the LAPD found 44 officers out of thousands of police. 44 officers were producing a huge proportion of all the complaints and causing a lot of the bad reputation that the LAPD was getting at that time. So when you can identify this power few, sometimes people call them the rotten apples in the barrel, but I think that understates their importance because it doesn't mean that the overall barrel then doesn't suffer a problem with a reputation for rottenness. It's the rotten apples that you got to get out of that barrel if you want to have good quality control in your apples. And that's why you can't just say, let's train every police officer to fix those 44 out of 6,000. You need to do something about those 44. That's the power few approach. That's what targeting is in evidence-based policing.
And you can actually represent this graphically in the Pareto curve.
That's right. It looks like a hockey stick. It looks like with the very first and most active offenders or most productive researchers, whoever is producing most of the activity, you go with them first and you add up all of their contribution, and within 5 or 10% of the whole population, you've hit 50% or more of whatever you're measuring, whether it's crime or something good. And after that, each new unit doesn't contribute very much, so it sort of levels off. That's why it looks like a hockey stick, and if you come from a part of the world where they don't play hockey, I suppose you could say it looks like a boomerang.
So this brings us to milestone number 9.
Yes, the targeting of police resources with systematic evidence can leverage greater public safety at less cost than unsystematic allocations. It's a general proposition that has been supported across test after test of how police allocate their resources. If they just do it in a haphazard or subjective way, they're not going to get the same return on investment as if they use the evidence to find the power few.
So why is
a very high percentage of that?
Excuse me, I'm sorry. the question really is whether that's long enough, right? I mean, I will start by criticizing this tape, because if you really think about doing this in a police station, there's two big segments there already, the overview of the 3 Ts, and then getting into depth on targeting. Whew, I'm worn out. Maybe that's enough. But the good thing about this is, even though I'm not very competent at doing it, you can stop the video. And we could set up a curriculum by which day one, you take 6 minutes with the 3 Ts and the overview, and maybe have a brief discussion about that, or maybe just watch as much as we just did, and then have a discussion about that, come back the next day to see what this testing is about. Then to get further into it, as you sort of go along day by day, week by week, there's a whole video on targeting. There's a whole video on the crime harm index, which is a tool for targeting based on seriousness and not just frequency of crimes. And then testing as a general concept, but also testing things that you do with hotspots, testing things you do with serious offenders, testing things that you do with repeat victims. So all these different targets can be subjected to tests of what's the best way to police them or to prevent crime. And then, some of the key issues in policing that are emerging with new technologies, GPS, body-worn video cameras, that sort of thing. And I can show you a whole video here on the experiment with police wearing cameras in California. These are raising tracking questions, the third T, that I think police have a huge stake in. And we're very pleased we've just gotten the president of the labor organization for constables, sergeants, inspectors, and chief inspectors in England and Wales, and that's about 100,000 police. And for the first time, he will join and keynote with several other police leaders the annual conference on evidence-based policing that takes place in Cambridge, with 3 days of research being presented now, for the most part, by police officers. The majority of the research papers being presented at this conference were supervised by Cambridge academics. The research was undertaken by the police officers. We're crafting their PowerPoint slides. We're rehearsing the sessions to keep them nice, crisp, and short, not long and boring like professors, or at least like me, and try to keep it going. But I want to get some other people up here to talk about this, but before we leave the video tape, could I specially invite those of you who have been to Cambridge about how you think a discussion after watching a part or all of a video like this would go in a field setting, or whether you think, for example, it might go better if the officers get a whole day to be assigned to a training day, and they can watch the videos for as much or as little of each section, and then you can go into discussions back and forth between watching the video, having the discussion. A lot of the research shows that no matter where you're doing it, the mixed media, or even PowerPoint slides plus a video plus a discussion, and even a little lecture like I'm doing, mixed media works better than a single medium, like all lecture or all videos. So I think if we start with that research and we say, okay, here in Sweden, what's the venue? Do we have people who could lead discussions on this in police stations? Is it better to bring them into the 91 area offices, or the 34 sub-regional offices, or the 7 big regions now? You know a lot more about how it's all structured. And any Cambridge people here want to give me feedback about that? Or indeed anybody? Yes. Oh, good. We have the microphone. I keep forgetting that everybody has to speak to the microphone.
Yeah, hi. I'm Joe. I'm going at the Cambridge course right now, the first year. I think it would, one day or not, I think it perhaps a mix. When you start up, perhaps have a one day to get the group together and talk, and then try to spread it out in a way. But I think that from my point of view, to lead discussions, I think it would be try to get Swedish examples and the Swedish context to complement this,
Right.
to use the discussion to get it down. Sometimes the examples aren't really easygoing to transfer to the Swedish context, and I think it would be easier to get the knowledge out if you have this compared with like compendium or small examples of examples.
So there could be, for example, a list of discussion questions that would start with Swedish examples. Say, so take the power of few, and then a Swedish example, we actually have a hotspot study in Gothenburg.
Yeah.
And you could even use the PowerPoint slides from Maybert Ronaldo's street maps of where the crimes are concentrated and talk about what that means for policing Gothenburg.
Yeah.
Good, thank you. Other comments on introducing this material through discussions with police at various levels? Doesn't necessarily have to be patrol, it could be investigators. And this is a well-known Swedish police officer from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, named Professor John McDonald. Hello, John.
So, hi. Some work I've been doing with the New York Police Department. They're big now on trying to do role play scenarios, and I was wondering if you thought about how scenarios, kind of simulations could be done with the evidence-based policing model here.
Well, that's really interesting, because the closest thing we've gotten to it is in Uruguay, where we trained people who had left school at 15 how to analyze a spreadsheet. And we said, here are the data for the area you're patrolling, identify your hotspots, which is a kind of role play. and then the next question was, okay, what are you going to do about them? And talk about how you might police differently once you've done that analysis. So yeah, I think there's lots of potential for hands-on engagement. But whether, that's the capacity to teach people how to do that is distributed is I guess, one of the implementation questions that we'd have to follow through in planning this. And speaking of implementation, may I just say that this is not just an academic discussion, because I think you're in a position right now with all the discussions on the future of knowledge and policing to have support for quite a large number of Swedish police to get involved in being champions of evidence-based policing. People who are doing regular jobs, but who are also available to lead these discussions, to show videos or whatever. And the best preparation, I would argue, for a champion who, as in the application of agricultural research in the United States over the last 100 years, there's 30,000 champions of research application in American agriculture. They're employed by the U.S. Department of Agriculture through the local universities. They spend a lot of time literally in the field talking with the farmers about how to improve the productivity of their farms, and it's all about talking face-to-face about what this research really means. So the history of the champion model is great. And if anybody in this room wants to be a champion and wants to go do the hard work at Cambridge, as well as the fun nights, the opportunity, I think, is here. I think the only limit on the number of Swedish police officers who would want to go down that path is how many want to do it. If the demand is there, I'd be very optimistic as I read the cards here in Sweden, and indeed in other countries, that there would be support. Just as in Denmark, just in the waning months of last year, with lots of political turmoil, they managed to make many applications and identify 12 people who showed up in Cambridge on the last week of March, and have started the program. There'll be 12 more coming, so there'll be a total of 24 Danish police, and of course they're only half the size of the Swedish police. So that would be 50 police from Sweden a year just to keep up with Denmark. And I know you want to keep up with Denmark. At this point, I think I'm going to ask Max. Where's Max? Max, could you, I know you have to leave by 1. Could you come and say would you like to come up and say what you wanted to say now, so we can be sure that we capture your your presentation before you have to go at 2. Well, I'm not sure that we'll have everybody here still then. So it's your decision. And if you'd rather do it when you come back at, you think about 3? Yeah. Okay, so you need the time when you come back at 3. Right. Can I just check with the people in the room, how many of you will be staying after 3? Okay, about half. So your call, Max. If you wanted to go now, that's fine. If you want to do it when you come back, and maybe have more of a exclusively policing audience, it's up to you entirely. Okay, good. Now, do you have your slides yet? Or we just have to put the stick in? Good. And while they're doing that, I'm going to introduce Professor Jerzy Sarnecki, who has recently retired from the University of Stockholm and who is teaching at the University of Gävle to an undergraduate program. Yeah, I can't say it, but I used to go to a Finnish village called Jarvala, so I keep going back to that. Could you come speak to this mic?
What do you want me to say?
I want you to talk about whether Swedish universities could also be a place to discuss videos like this, to make it part of that undergraduate curriculum.
Well, good afternoon. Well, I'm teaching since a few months at this program which Larry is talking about.
Cambridge as well.
And so maybe I'm not the perfect person to tell you about the whole program because I just survived the first part of it. We have additional, I'm going there in June again and in September. But what I would think is that, well, I could confirm to some extent what Larry is saying about the people on the undergraduate level, sort of people who are going to the police high school, well, police university, whatever we call it in Sweden. It's complicated, as you know. Where I'm teaching criminology in Södertälje at the ordinary courses for police officers. And I'm talking quite a lot about the police, evidence-based policing, and they are looking at me, and they're extremely polite. They are very nice people, but they are extremely intelligent, but this is not exactly their cup of coffee. Why? Because they are dreaming to be police officers, and to them, police is still kind of, you know, driving the car, shooting, solving crimes, all this stuff, which is what you expect of when you go to the police education. So when I'm talking about the evidence-based policing, they're listening, but they can't put it in this sort of reality of their daily life because they don't know yet how it works. And my experience we had at the Stockholm University pretty many years ago, the education for more senior police officers, and when we were talking about the same stuff, there were totally different reaction. They were listening because they knew what all this was about. I mean, you could talk to them about the hotspots, you could talk about the networks and all these things we were talking about. So this is totally different situation. That's why I think that, of course, we could do it on the undergraduate level, we should do it in the undergraduate level. I can add that I'm teaching at the university in Gävle, where we have the kind of course in applied criminology, or the education in applied criminology, and these people we will meet probably many of them as the civilian investigators and civilian researchers in our ER system, and these people are of course also very interested about it, but still they don't have this kind of empirical experience what police work is about.
So Max has thoughts about what to do with the people who are experienced, and do you want to stand here by the computer, or shall I?
Well, you want me to move, obviously.
No, I'm going to sit down with you to
Thank you, Larry. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Max Lutteman. I'm in head of the Division of Competence Province for the Swedish Police Authority. And I will give a short lecture for 20 minutes about how we use it across Sweden, Swedish Police. And the target group is the one from Sweden. So I will switch from English to Swedish. I think it's easier to have that discussion. But if you want to have it translated, Joa and Marika, is she here, promised me that you can have some translation. The slides are in English, so it's easier to follow. So it's a kind of mix. Okej? Good. Så nu blir det svenska. Och det är väl det här med polisarbete. Man får vara beredd på allt möjligt. Det är reaktiva. Jag tänker dra lite i stora drag utifrån ett kompetensförsörjning och kompetensutvecklingsperspektiv. Hur vi jobbar med den här frågan och sånt som relaterar till det forskningsbaserade, det evidensbaserade. Och ni får ställa frågor efterhand, så ser vi var vi hamnar. Lite sådär grund för er som inte jobbar i organisationen, så har vi tidigare haft en organisation med 21 länsmyndigheter och totalt bestod polisen av 23 olika myndigheter i gamla organisationen. Våra politiker beslutade i enighet att det här skulle ändras. Vi skulle bli en myndighet. Så från 1/1/2015 så är vi en polismyndighet uppdelat i 7 regioner och ett antal avdelningar. Och lite annat runt omkring. Men i stora drag är det så det ser ut. 2 stora rörelser som inte är helt lätta att göra tillsammans. Men de är väldigt centrala i den reform som vi nu håller på att genomföra. Den här rörelsen, det är enhetligheten. Att vi ska få en polis som är kvalitetssäkrad och kan jobba enhetligt över hela Polissverige. Vi såg i gamla organisationen, de 21 myndigheterna, de gjorde det här på eget sätt. Och det blev väl helt okej. Men det blev väldigt olika. Nu har vi möjlighet att göra det här enhetligt. Och jag kommer återkomma till det lite från ett forskningsperspektiv vad det innebär. Samtidigt så gör vi en annan rörelse som är kanske mer decentraliserande. Det vill säga vi ska gå ut och jobba närmare medborgarna. Närmare problemen. Och det kopplar också en hel del till det forskningsbaserade. Det blir nästan en grund för att vi ska klara de här 2 ganska utmanande rörelserna. Kompetensförsörjningsenheten, där jag är chef. Lite kort bara hur vi är organiserade och hur vi kan använda den organisationen i arbetet med att kompetensutveckla organisationen, samarbeta tillsammans med utvecklingscentrum. Ni kommer senare få höra Håkan Jarlborg prata om vissa delar, vi har ett nära samarbete. För att vi ska vara mer decentraliserade, finnas närmare medarbetarna. Och medarbetarna i sin tur ska ju vara närmare medborgarna. Vi följer med ut. Kompetensutveckling ska ske så nära verksamheten som möjligt och i verksamheten i så hög grad som möjligt. Då har vi skapat 4 stycken kompetenscentrum som finns placerade runt i Sverige. I 4 stycken huvudorter, men som i sin tur är utspridda över de regioner man har ansvar för. De ser ni här och huvudorterna är ju Umeå, Stockholm, Göteborg och Malmö. Och då kan man säga att Polishögskolan, som ni ser finns där, Police Academy, de upphör att existera som organisation vid årsskiftet. Och all grundutbildning kommer genomföras på 3 stycken lärosäten. Det är Umeå universitet, Södertörns högskola och Linnéuniversitetet. Och jag tänker återkomma lite till grundutbildningen och hur det kopplar till att jobba med forskning. Och jag kommer berätta lite om den polisutbildningsutredning, det betänkandet som lämnades till regeringen den 31 maj, där jag satt med som polisens representant i expertgruppen. Upphör. Sen har vi en sektion som jobbar, vi kallar den sektionen för planering och styrning, som håller i det övergripande när det gäller kompetensförsörjningen. Kompetensutvecklingen, utbildningen, den sker där ute. Men det är väldigt mycket runt det. Och det är bland annat där Johan, som ställde frågan här, arbetar. Och vi har väldigt hög kompetens. Jag tror vi har ett antal forskare, flera disputerade. Så att där finns en bra grundstomme som nu jobbar med de här frågorna när det gäller evidensbaserat polisarbete. Bra. Tack. I organisationen, så även om vi jobbar fortfarande med vad det egentligen innebär, så har vi ansvar fördelade. Det finns de som har processansvar för vissa områden, så finns det de som har funktionsansvar. Vi på HR, vi har funktionsansvar för kompetensförsörjningsprocessen. Och det är ett stort paraply som man kan sammanfatta att det handlar om att attrahera kompetens, rekrytera, göra urval av kompetens, utveckla kompetensen, mer renodlad utbildning, också behålla kompetensen, fort- och vidareutbildning och annat. Men också kunna växla kompetens för att få en hållbarhet i det här. Så det är det uppdraget som min enhet har. Den stora delen som vi har och där vår personal jobbar med, det är just utbildning, kompetensutveckling. De cirka 350 kurser vi genomför årligen. Den nya organisationen ställer nya krav och ger nya möjligheter. Vi ser att lokalpolisområdena, har vi några lokalpolisområdeschefer här inne idag? Trevligt. Ni är stommen, ni är hjärtat i den organisation vi har byggt. Jag skulle kunna påstå att det är i alla fall i stor utsträckning där det avgörs om vi klarar vårt uppdrag mot medborgarna och samhället. Jätteviktigt. Och där tror vi att det evidensbaserade kan vara en förutsättning för att kunna klara det uppdraget på ett bra sätt. Vi har väl runt 100 lokalpolisområden, plus minus, som ska kunna jobba relativt självständigt, autonomt, men ändå hålla enhetligheten, hålla kvaliteten. Och då måste vi ha metoder att tillgå som kan användas. Och det är inte att man ska vara forskare där ute, men vi ska ha metoder som är framtagna som bygger på en grund, en evidensbaserad grund, som är lätt att använda. Professor Sherman pratade om Steve Jobs som lyckades väldigt bra med det här användarvänliga. Det måste vi ha här också. Vi måste ha metoder som är lätta att använda så att de också fungerar ute i verksamheten, långt fram där vi möter medborgarna. Så att det är en viktig del i det här. Och sen har vi då polisregionerna och avdelningarna som ska finnas som ett stöd. Och där har mer expertkunskap att kunna jobba fram metoder. Självklart tillsammans med verksamheten, men också tillsammans med relevanta aktörer som har rätt kompetens. Vi har ju exempelvis en relevant aktör här idag och det är professor Sherman från Cambridge, en viktig aktör. Vi har andra här, Malmö högskola. Vi har flera aktörer som vi måste samarbeta med. Så vi skapar ett bra system och där vi använder den kompetens som finns. Jag ska flytta mig lite närmare. Förlåt. Närmare vinkeln. Absolut. Tack. Yes. Thank you. Det var lite inne på det. Det ska vara lätt att använda. Alla ska inte bli forskare. Det är de här generella delarna. Och sen att vi ska ha de här specifika kompetenserna in-house. Men för att kunna använda den kompetens som finns, de intressanta aktörer som kan bidra till att polisverksamheten verkligen blir effektivare utifrån hela grundtanken med reformen. Lite grann om hur vi gör det här kommer Håkan Jarlborg som är chef för Utvecklingscentrum Syd återkomma till lite senare. Så där får ni det presenterat. Jag tänker berätta lite vad som händer inom HR-området och ganska aktuell information om det här arbetet med att svensk polis gör lite annorlunda än vad dansk polis gör just nu. Det vill säga vi har ett förslag som gör att vi går mot en högskoleutbildning och vi kommer skapa ett nytt huvudämne, polisiärt arbete. Och det kommer innebära en hel del, självklart när det gäller grundutbildningen och kvaliteten för den, men också allt som följer till, hela forskningsbiten. Och i betänkandet så är det här ganska väl presenterat om hur vi ska kunna lösa det på ett bra sätt. BRÅ kommer kopplas in. Vi föreslår att BRÅ ska göra en tydlig kartläggning. Vi kommer skapa forskarskolor där man har tydliga kriterier för hur ska vi göra urval till vem som ska forska. Hur ska det här skötas ekonomiskt? Det finns en proposition nu om polisforskning som man håller på att jobba med och man kommer lyfta in polisens del i den propositionen. Så den är viktig. I grunden så kommer det bli en kandidatexamen på 180 högskolepoäng. Och det är tillsammans med ungefär 20 andra yrkesexamina som finns i Sverige. Sjuksköterskan igen, logoped, ortoped, det finns en hel mängd av yrkesexamina. Och planen är att det här ska starta på hösten 2018. Vi ska bara ta oss förbi en tröskel och det är riksdagen. Det här måste beslutas. Vi föreslår cirka 22 förändringar i olika förordningar. Och då måste det befattas i ett riksdagsbeslut. Mesta talar för att det kommer gå vägen. Regeringen är ganska tydlig med att de vill det här. Sen finns det väl andra som tycker andra saker, men vi förväntar oss att det här kommer gå igenom. Det kommer vara högskolorna som blir ansvariga för utbildningen. Polisen kommer tappa det inflytandet vi har idag. Däremot kommer vi samarbeta på annat sätt. Utan nu blir utbildningen en del av hela högskolesystemet och högskoleförordningen. Universitetskanslerämbetet kommer bli jätteviktiga. De kommer till att börja med välja vilka lärosäten som kommer få uppdraget. Det vill säga det är inte givet. Vi har ju 3 lärosäten som ligger ganska bra till. De har bra förutsättningar att klara det här. Men alla måste söka och kvaliteten kommer följas upp av just UKÄ. Ja, och sen så föreslår vi en hel del runt forskning när det gäller kopplingen till det kandidatprogram som finns. För det handlar om polisens fort- och vidareutbildning som kopplas in i ett nytt system. Även om vi fortfarande kan välja vilken del av vår fort- och vidareutbildning ska vara akademisk, vilken ska inte vara det. Den polisiära konflikthanteringen helt enkelt, som handlar om taktik och annat, nej, den ska inte vara det. Men mycket av det andra vi gör kommer vi bygga i det nya systemet. Jag ska andas lite så att ni får möjlighet att ställa frågor också, men jag har inte sett några händer ännu. Ja, vi kommer samarbeta nära. En viktig del är den verksamhetsförlagda praktiken. Idag får varje polisstudent en aspiranttermin där man har polismansbefogenhet och verkligen får pröva den teoretiska kompetens man har fått och sätta den i ett sammanhang. Den kommer nu finnas som en verksamhetsförlagd utbildning som styrs av lärosätena och som är poängsatt. 37,5 poäng, vilket motsvarar 25 veckor och det är samma längd som vi har på aspirantterminen idag. Och som jag sa tidigare, universitetskanslerämbetet kommer att vara de som sakgranskar utbildningen och följer kvaliteten. Ja, jag har varit lite inne på den här vidareutbildningen, att den verkligen ska koppla till det nya högskolesystemet, vilket leder till de nivåerna vi har när det gäller forskning. Det är inte så att alla poliser ska jobba med forskning, men vi vill ha fler poliser, eller polisanställda skulle jag säga, som har en grund så att vi får en forskning som är verksamhetsnära och tillämpad och bidrar till den här bilden jag visade förut, den här enhetligheten, kvaliteten och att vi jobbar närmare medborgarna långt ut. Det är en liten grundtes. Vi arbetar redan nu med att ta fram system för hur vi ska jobba med forskning, just för att möta förslaget från polisutbildningsutredningen. Och det är ett samarbete vi har med Utvecklingscentrum och ett samarbete som är startat utav rikspolischefen Dan Eliasson. Vi ska göra en delrapport, eller en slutrapport helt enkelt, i september om hur vi ser på det här tillsammans. Och det handlar mycket om utvecklingsfrågor och mycket om just kompetensutvecklingsdelen av det här. Så då kommer vi ha lite mer konkret att komma med. Och det var lite snabbt, lite inkastat, men det kanske kommer i rätt ordning. So, please, Professor Sherman, that's it.
I know you have to go.
Yes.
Did you ask them questions?
I will ask them again.
Oh, okay.
Any question?
Yeah. Good. If you ask
Yes.
in English, you know, you get a great
Yes,
response.
we take it in English. Yes.
For the question.
You can decide yourself, Swedish or English.
Okay. I will dare to ask in English.
Great.
The new police program that you speak of is 180
Credit points, yes.
points, and that is 100 more than today, which means it will be quite longer in period. Because today's education is 2 years and then 6 months of practical work. Have you thought anything about that there will be a gap of police officers coming out in the community?
The delivering of
Yeah,
police
exactly.
officers. Yes. And right now we are increasing the number of students for the police academies. We will start next semester, 2017, with 800 students on that semester. And then we will continue just to make sure that we have we are raising the number of police officers from 20,000 today, and hopefully we will have 22,000 police officers in 2020.
Okay.
And it's the training is 6 months longer. So it's
6 months longer.
30 credit points.
Okay.
If you translate it.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
That sounds like a very important question. Thank
Yes.
I have a question. You mentioned that there are 3 universities that are in charge of the education, and I'm at the KTH and doing some of the research that might be relevant methodologically. So my question is, how can we support this kind of development in the police education? Other universities, how can other universities be engaged in this development?
Could I just say, I know he's got to go to a meeting that's going to discuss that and make decisions for the whole country. So maybe we can get into that when I know we're going to have another presentation later on, and I think that's a key issue. If we can just put that on hold and come back to it. In fact, we might even have Max back by then. But I don't want to hold you up.
Thank you.
I want to thank you for taking questions and giving everybody a clear view of where the organization is, and to be continued.
Yes.
So,
Great.
thanks.
Thank you very much. And we will not forget the question. It's an important question. We'll get back.
Yeah, good. Okay, so if we could actually set up the other computer with the sound and change, and I will speak into the microphone while that's being done, and to say that this transition with the development of a new curriculum is a historic opportunity for any police service to rethink some basic questions about the mission of the organization and the way in which it wants to make decisions. Because policing is decision-making. Every day, thousands, millions of decisions are being made. And the question is, how are those decisions being guided? Are they being made in a way that will improve public safety and protect human rights? And I think the growing consensus in Sweden certainly is that that's a better way to go. I'm happy to say that the Stockholm Prize, now in its 11th year, has helped to make both the major parties in this country at least speak about the role of knowledge in a much more persistent way. we, I think, could still profit from having a lot more evaluations and especially randomized controlled trials when it comes to testing here in Sweden. But we don't need to have just randomized trials. We can have lots of good quasi-experiments. And even more importantly, we can have more targeting studies, which is the fundamental question of not so much what we do, but where we aim the efforts. And to sort of continue to think about why targeting studies absolutely have to be local. I'll just mention that we were working in Western Australia, a major city called Perth, where we expected to find hotspots. And we did the data analysis in Perth, and in central Perth, the oldest part of the city, maybe 2 square miles, they had hotspots. The rest of the city is 500 square miles, no hotspots. Crime didn't concentrate on certain street corners. There's some hotspots of property crime, the parking lots around the commuter train stations going out in the suburbs. But you couldn't take the 10 hotspot studies in the United States and just start policing Perth without having done that local targeting analysis in Perth. And I think in Queensland, they have also seen that while there may be central city hotspots, there are not so many hotspots in the more dispersed suburban areas. And I would imagine that different parts of Sweden would have very different targeting results, very different levels of concentration of harm among places. But then when you get to offenders, and especially terrorists, what is the big discussion in the United States this week? Story after story. Why didn't the FBI figure out that this guy, born in the United States, of Afghan parents, whose father supports the Taliban, and who was connected to a suicide bomber, why didn't they predict that he was going to go into this nightclub and kill 49 people? Well, you know, if you talk about weather forecasting, how many times has it rained in Stockholm in the last 1,000 years? And how many times have 49 people been shot down by assault rifles in an American nightclub in the last 1,000 years? Well, I think the last question, the answer is 0. And it's very hard to predict things that have never happened before. So I don't want to second guess the FBI, but what I can say is that targeting has come up again and again with respect to intelligence about terrorists. And when the Boston Marathon bombing occurred, we heard the same discussion because there was the same history of prior listing of the bombers on the intelligence list. And they didn't make it high enough on the list, which is a statistical problem. It is a question that research can help to answer by using the algorithms of big data. And what that means is that if you've got 30 or 40,000 people on your terrorist potential list, as the United States does, even Britain has close to 50,000, but they can only afford to put 2,000 of them under surveillance. They could pick those 2,000 by having committees sit around and say, oh, I think this guy's more dangerous than that guy. Oh, no, I think you're wrong. And, you know, everybody has opinions. And that's called opinion-based policing. If you want evidence-based policing, you can actually gather lots of data and see which variables predict the greatest harm and which variables don't. And in 2009, at the University of Pennsylvania, we did that with murderers in Philadelphia for the first time. And that method has now been applied in Durham, England, with Durham data, not Philadelphia data, not England-wide data, just Durham data. And in Durham, when somebody is arrested for auto theft or shoplifting or getting into a bar fight, and they come into the police station, their name goes into a database, and within 15 seconds, it tells the custody sergeant whether or not this person is low risk of doing any serious harm in the next 2 years. And how accurate is that assessment? Well, Dr. Jeffrey Barnes worked for a year with the Durham data, and he can say that it is 98% accurate. 2 times in 100, that person might wind up doing something as harmful as a grievous assault, where they might stab somebody or even commit serious sexual assault. But 98 times out of 100, this sergeant can be sure that if he puts this fellow out on bail, gives him a caution, or somehow doesn't pursue the idea of prosecuting the case, that this person is relatively safe. They make the same decisions all over England every day, but only in Durham do they make it with evidence. Everywhere else, it is back to opinion-based policing. I look at the rap sheet, what's here is all I need. What is this statistical stuff that going to tell me that's any different from what I'm seeing right here? Well, I'll give you a good example. One of the things people don't look at is how young somebody was when they were first charged with a serious offense. And it is a great predictor of murder, even 30 years later. But it's not the kind of thing people normally look at on the rap sheet. They might say, well, this guy's, he's only had 3 arrests. He's 21, he's only had 3 arrests before. He doesn't look very serious. But if he tried to rob somebody when he was 12, the computer knows that that is a great predictor of very serious harm. And the computer will tell you in a way that nobody can figure out intuitively. In a way, you know, experience is very important for doctors, for engineers, for police. Having the computer look at 50,000 cases is like having 50,000 police officers' experience combined. And I don't think in a nation with as much modesty as Sweden that anybody would want to claim that they know as much as 50,000 police officers, because that's what the computer can support you with. In the end, the decisions are made by police, must be made by police, but targeting decisions can be informed by systematic evidence in that way, so that there will be less risk that somebody looks safe and they're dangerous, which is called a false negative. We had a false negative in the US when there was a meeting about whether airplanes could be hijacked and flown into buildings. And the opinion of the committee was, well, no, of course not. Nobody would do that because then they wouldn't survive. What about suicide bombing? Oh, we've never had that in the United States. Okay, so this is 1999. There's not a problem with airplanes flying into buildings. False negative. We said there's no problem. That was wrong. False positive is what happens every time we go to the airport and we have to take off our shoes. And 40,000 officers of the Transportation Safety Agency in the United States are making sure that every one of us who is not going to be carrying a weapon is actually not carrying a weapon. You could probably think about that algorithmically too, but that's not our job here today. I think today we're thinking more about who is going to kill their wife, which happens in Sweden every year, I think. Can we do a better job of forecasting domestic homicides or serious domestic harm? Well, we're on the trail of that. In several countries now, it looks like the best predictor of whether somebody's going to kill their spouse is a previous attempted suicide. Somebody who has attempted to kill themselves is much more likely to go on to kill or try to kill their spouse than people who have never attempted suicides. That was true in Thames Valley, England. It was not quite so true in Dorset. It is definitely true in Western Australia, where we have looked at over 200,000 domestic violence cases and well over 100 domestic homicides. And I don't know if it's true in Sweden, but I know how you can find out. You can do the research in Sweden. You can compile the histories of all of the people who have attempted to kill their partners in the last 10 years in Sweden, which would be probably over 100. I would think if we include the unsuccessful attempts to kill and then draw a match sample of people who have also been arrested even for violent offenses, but have never tried to kill their partners. These are tools that can be understood by operational police officers. They don't have to do the analysis, but I think it's clear that if you do the analysis and you don't have an audience that wants to consume that analysis, you can have the most beautiful research in the world and it won't have any effect. So the challenge is to go beyond where the Japanese police were in the year 2005. They produced fabulous hotspot maps of Tokyo. They presented it to the Tokyo Police Command. They said, thank you very much, and didn't do one thing with it. They still patrol equally all over Tokyo without going to these huge volcanoes of violence, which have much higher risks of violence than the rest of the city. And that is down to the fact that the analysis alone, the evidence alone, doesn't sell itself. You've got to have people get excited about getting better results if they use evidence. And that's what we see increasingly from critical mass. The more people we have from one police area in Britain, like Thames Valley, which now has had 20 people come to the Cambridge course, the more of them there are, the more they talk to each other, and the more they influence everybody else. A couple years ago, when Don Eliasson was still in another job, he happened to go riding with some police officers in Stockholm. And they started telling him about the hotspots they were going to, because they'd heard about hotspots at the Stockholm Criminology Symposium when David Weisberg won the Stockholm Prize in 2010. And so there was all this talk about hotspots, and they immediately went out on the street and they got excited about using crime mapping in this way, which they hadn't done before, at least as far as they were telling Don about it. And that's, I think, an example of where we can go if we start thinking not about creating a great product, but creating a group of people who want the product. The demand probably needs to precede the supply. The demand for the automobile, I think, was there because people already had horses and buggies, and the car was faster. So that wasn't Henry Ford's problem. He didn't need to create the demand, he could create the better product. But when you come to anything in the area of custom or practice, where people are doing things a certain way and making decisions in a certain way, for example, making decisions to drink before they get into a car. And that's the way they were raised. If you look at the death rates from automobile accidents in the 1920s, they're absolutely horrendous because people used to drink and get behind the reins of a horse and go home in a horse and buggy, and they didn't have to worry about the same kind of crash risks as they did with the automobile. But what did we do? We tried to change the way people think about making that decision. And we used lots of different tools. We used morality, we used sanctions, but we used the principles of behavioral change that are now embedded in marketing, in public health, and in many other areas. And that's really what I think we're trying to do through engaging police at Cambridge, not just in listening to this kind of talk, but in doing things, hands-on, going out and looking at the data and looking at what they can do with these ideas. So how many of you are here because there was a need for your unit to be represented here? Is a question that probably nobody's going to put their hand up in response to. How many of you, let's put it the other way, how many of you are here for reasons that you would think are completely voluntary? And the fellow who's leaving is Australian, so he doesn't count. Bye, Rick. Well, Okay, so maybe half the room is an admitted volunteer, and that takes courage too, so thank you very much. And I guess I would like to hear from any of you at this point, what further steps could be taken in Swedish police to increase the interest in evidence-based policing, to increase the demand, to increase the appetite to consume research findings that could be practical and important in the work that people are doing. You know, we have this course, we have these videos, we will have research projects. What else would create that appetite? Professor Sarnecki, we have the microphone coming right to you, so hold that thought, and here it is. Do you want to stand and face everyone?
Thank you. I thought I was expected to say something before I have to leave.
Yes, thank you.
So well, I think that the most important thing about all this discussion is that people who are working in practical jobs on the floor, in the streets, must have some kind of feedback on what they're doing. Which means that if you want people to use knowledge to improve their work, they must know that the things they are doing matters, and the things they are doing are coming back to them as a result of the work. Thank you. That's just about what I was talking about. So what you need to do, I guess, is create a system of measuring effects of the police work at the very local level. Because if people could see the effects, statistical results of the work, they could, of course, improve their work. Otherwise, they won't. I'm not talking exactly about a CompStat, but I'm talking about something which remains to some extent the CompStat, but of course developed, and CompStat is the system that they were using in New York, but of course very developed, adjusted to the Swedish circumstances, etc. And I think this is the most important part if you want people to use the knowledge to improve their work.
So could I just continue your thought with you for a moment and show you what was given to the patrol officers doing the patrols in the violent hotspots in Trinidad at a time when we were trying to increase those patrols. And what you see here is the data on 4 different patrol teams. On the left-hand side is the nighttime patrols from 6 p.m. to 8 a.m., and on the right-hand side is the daytime patrols from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. The teams are from the left, A, B, C, D, and then from the middle, again, A, B, C, D. And so they sit once a week with the district supervisor, and they talk about why they aren't spending more time in patrol at the targeted locations. And the long-term effect of this was actually to raise, this is a picture of, they're sitting around in the police station, feeding back, as Professor Sarnecki once said, this is what you are doing. This is the performance. And nobody's getting punished, nobody's getting disciplined. We're just talking about what could happen. And this is actually what happened. Homicides went down where this feedback was being used. That's the dotted line. Homicides went up where the feedback was not being used. And we didn't have good measures of how much more patrol there was, but we had lots of citizens saying, gosh, we're seeing a lot more police where the dotted line was going down for essentially a 40% reduction in shootings, woundings, and homicides in a randomized controlled trial. That's another way of looking at it. These 20 police districts were matched on their shootings and murders in the period of time going up to the first vertical black line. And the red was the control group stations. The blue was those that, once that black line came down, that's where they started the feedback. And with the feedback, the blue line shows shootings, woundings going down. The red line showing no feedback, the shootings, woundings going up. Now, there's lots of causes of murder in Trinidad, and so police patrol was only trying to hold back the tide.
Yes.
The tide was clearly going up on the red, but with the feedback and trying to focus the patrol, the tide was held back down with the blue. And just to show you the long-term effect of putting this out to all of the district commanders, as Professor Sarnecki knows, that yellow line is the average number of minutes per day in a violent hotspot that the police were generating. And this feedback was given to all of the division commanders for the whole country, once a week with the police commissioner, saying it's got to go up. And he also had 7 areas, like Sweden, and they had their own bar graph. So there was feedback on what are you doing to try to get the homicide rate down. Now look at the yellow line. The more it's going up to over 100 minutes a day per violent hotspot, the homicide rate is coming down. And then it plummeted. And it was a great success. Too bad it changed. And it went back up again. And there's a lesson there, which is that you have to keep changing tactics. But I just want to say, this is what you mean by feedback, right? To give this measurement.
This is exactly what I mean, and you can add that Trinidad has one very important plus compared to Sweden, is that they have a better weather.
Better weather.
Yes, but otherwise the technical possibilities to do this kind of things in this country are much bigger. So you could have a much more sophisticated system here to do these things. And one extremely important part, this is the last point that I'm leaving to this door, is of course that this kind of feedback must be given immediately, not after the 3 weeks or 3 months or 3 years, but tomorrow.
Yes, and that's exactly how they set it up there. Thank you, Jerzy. He's my best friend, so anything you want to ask him, you can ask me.
No, yeah,
See you, Jerzy.
my point is, you asked what probably should be in place for this model work in Sweden, and I think
Sorry, what needs to be in place?
in place for your model work here in Sweden. So you posed this question.
Oh,
right?
I asked.
Yeah, you asked.
Yes.
Yeah.
How do we get...
Exactly. So
demand.
I think one of my suggestions would be the following, that policing nowadays is more than police officers. Although we work with, or attempt to, doing evidence police to some extent, a lot of policing, especially in rural areas, is done by people that are not police officers. So I think the key question is how to engage other actors, and here we call the lokala brottsförebyggande rådet, the local crime prevention councils, engaged in these evidence-based activities. Because today, policing is not only one actor's role. And I think we would be able to use those actors in the process, because then you would have the whole community engaged in the process. It's a suggestion, because I think that is one way of going, especially in rural areas where you have sometimes no police officers, or you have a whole police district which is as big as Scotland. Yes. So the point is, remoteness is something crucial, especially in the north parts of Sweden. So then to engage police officers in evidence policing also has to pass to new ways of doing police and other actors that are engaged in policing.
Right, and I think these are all valuable suggestions. To go back to targeting, I found out this week that if you take 3 of the 7 regions in Sweden, Stockholm, south around Malmö, and is it called west around Gothenburg? Yeah, apparently you get most of the crime in 3 out of the 7. So even though I think there are very good democratic reasons why you want to serve a nation with equal competence, there's also good democratic reasons to provide to each according to their need, as opposed to according to their entitlement, as it were. And one of the hardest issues for policing is what we saw in the video earlier, which is triage. And this question of whether the highest crime areas have enough police and whether the lowest crime areas have more than enough police is one that collides with democracy, because nobody wants to have fewer police than they currently have. So actually, if you add 2,000 police in the next 3 years, that's an opportunity to concentrate more resources where they're most needed to prevent violence and to prevent social friction, which goes exactly to your point about the interagency groups. Because I think if you separate that point from going to the north, the opportunity to work on an interagency basis in places like Rinkeby with very high levels of harmful events per square foot, and the opportunity for police to leverage the resources of other agencies and to coordinate support for people who have come out of jail recently or people who are using drugs, to coordinate the disruption of drug sales in open places, which Minister Johansson was telling me is a problem in some of these areas. That is, I think, a very interesting way of creating more demand for data, more demand for better decision making. And it really raises the question of whether we should invite city planners, social service agencies, and others to take the same kind of course. And I wouldn't necessarily start it at Cambridge, because that's a very high-cost way to start it, but maybe these videos could be shown in these local crime prevention councils. And I hadn't thought about that before today, so thank you for that. Other ideas or warnings or other comments in relation to the question of appetite for making decisions differently in an organization that's already had so much structural change that it may be shell-shocked. And so the last thing they may want to hear is, well, let's talk about how we can make all our decisions differently. It may be better to say, well, there is something that will give you more control over your work, which is something everybody likes and which I think they feel they lose when there's reorganization. But I, again, am interested in hearing from you. And if not, I'll show you some more videos just to mix the media. No? Okay. So we have 26 videos up here. We have one on testing body-worn video cameras. We have one on domestic violence, policing domestic violence. We have one that gets involved in restorative justice, meetings between victims and offenders for relatively serious crimes. We have a variety of topics. Do I have any requests? I can also sing the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. We are here to give you 10 more minutes before we're going to give you tea, coffee, and cakes before we commence the second part of the discussion over next steps in the Swedish Police. Is anybody wearing body-worn videos in Sweden? Have they been tested in terms of whether they reduce the use of force or complaints against the police? Okay, if they haven't been tested, this is a good topic to address, because if we were able to go out and test the introduction of body-worn video cameras, which are not worn by every constable in Sweden yet, are they? Okay, so if they're not universal, this is really...
Everything else we think we know in policing
perhaps,
or science, until we find out from a new experiment.
Drang?
My name is Lawrence Sherman.
So, Larry, what's this chapter about?
Well, it's about police wearing cameras and videotaping everything they see and everything they hear as they're doing police work. It's something that has been tested at the University of Cambridge and the Rialto Police Department. But it was also, in terms of the 3 T's of evidence-based policing, something that was targeted by the police chief as a problem in relation to complaints. That is, the camera was potentially a solution to the problem of citizen complaints against the police that they had, as well as the use of force in police encounters. And once they got into it, they had to use that 3rd T of tracking to figure out how much police kept their cameras on or turned them off, and all of the issues that arise when you start to revolutionize policing and the relationship between the police and the public by having these cameras document what actually happened, who did what, who said what, from the viewpoint of the police officer.
So the idea of body-worn videos and the idea of testing them out before rolling them out, this is a pretty novel approach, and in some ways a really perfect example of the use of the triple T idea.
Yeah, it's a great example because the technology came along long after the whole framework of testing, targeting, and tracking really was being developed from the 1980s onwards. And the technology wasn't there until the 21st century. But when we started talking about it, and of course at Cambridge, then Chief Tony Farrar from Rialto, California, said that this is exactly the kind of thing that he wanted to test. And since then, I think it's become a prime example of evidence-based policing, and that's why we're starting with it, to help everybody taking this course understand how concrete and practical evidence-based policing is, not just depending on a lot of ivory tower theory, but depending on what police officers and citizens do in encounters on the street.
And it was Chief Tony Farrar who decided to come to Cambridge and learn about the triple T. Tell us something more about him and about his supervisor in Cambridge, Barak Ariel.
Well, Chief Farrar was somebody who talked to a police chief in California named Jim Bierman, who's now the president of the Police Foundation in Washington, and has worked very closely with the George Mason University team on evidence-based policing. So he got fired up about it through word of mouth, and implausible as it may seem that a California police chief would go all the way to Cambridge, England, it was the best place for him to learn what he wanted to learn and to do a master's thesis, because that's part of what we do in the master's program. Every student does a research project. For his research project, he wanted to test the use of cameras, and he did it in collaboration with one of the leading younger experimenters in criminology, who is now working on the same kind of experiment with police departments around the world as Dr. Barak Ariel of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, but primary appointment at Cambridge University at our Institute of Criminology and teaching in the Cambridge Police Executive Program.
So, body-worn video cameras, this looks like milestone number 1.
That's what we're going to code it as. The body-worn video cameras on police caused less use of force in encounters with citizens and a huge drop of complaints against police.
So tell us a bit more about when and where this experiment comes from.
Well, it was 2011. Tony Farrar was going to do his master's thesis at Cambridge, and in Rialto, California, which is near Los Angeles, in a city of 100,000 people, 157 police officers, he had the opportunity to work with an agency that wasn't huge, but which was one where he could really work with everybody face to face and create this opportunity for a whole new journey down the river of evidence-based policing.
So he really stands as a kind of exemplar of what it's possible to do in collaboration with researchers who have experience in this area. So tell us a bit about the research question and the research design.
Well, I think the research question was generally what effect would it have if the police wore these cameras all the time and could document who said what and who did what. The hypothesis that Tony had was that if all of the police on a shift, not just one officer or two officers, but if you create an environment where the citizen knows and the police know that everybody's wearing a camera, it would have two very measurable effects. One would be reducing complaints against the police, and the other would be reducing the use of force by the police. And the best way to test that, as we all discussed at Cambridge with him, would be a randomized controlled trial in which you wouldn't compare individual officers or even situations. You would just create this world on each shift of 8 hours in which every police officer is wearing a body-worn video camera. And because in the course of a year there's 988 shifts, each one of them got a kind of lottery ticket assignment to either have all of the police wear the body-worn video cameras or none of them. And so it's a completely opposite situation with the same police officers, same citizens, and perhaps more importantly, fair conditions in terms of daytime, et cetera. And so we were able to compare what happens in this world where all of the cops are wearing cameras or where none of them were.
And what was the reason that it was so important that each of the shifts was assigned by lottery to either all wear cameras or none wear cameras?
Well, the lottery is a really good tool for completely equalizing almost anything that could vary between two groups of roughly 500 shifts. Even if you go every other one, there's a potential for some sort of hidden bias, so that when each one comes up and there's a lottery method, it creates this situation of total equivalence in things like, is the shift at daytime or at nighttime? Is it with colder weather or warmer weather, raining or sunny, weekdays or weekends? Any other conditions that could affect the use of force, complaints, things like holidays or the sports events that drive Americans crazy, like the Super Bowl. All of these things are evened out with this kind of design, so in effect there's no bias. If there's a difference between the shifts where the police wear cameras and where they don't, the only thing that can cause that difference would be the cameras and not some peculiar characteristic of the kinds of shifts that they were doing this on.
So it's really all about removing other potential explanations for whatever result you get.
Yeah, that's really the key, because if you can take away any other possible hypothesis, as Sherlock Holmes said in the 19th century, whatever remains must be the cause, must be the reason that we use to explain the difference in behavior. And with a sample that big, almost 1,000 shifts, I think we can have a lot of confidence that what they found in Rialto was true in Rialto. Whether it's true in other places is a different question, but we have a very high quality experiment in Rialto that in effect is creating this whole new line of research around the world.
And this is very much on the medical model. This is what medical trials do.
Absolutely, and a lot of people are sometimes troubled by the idea of a lottery for making a decision like that. In a way, doing it with a shift is less troublesome than doing it on a case-by-case basis. So some people get cameras and others don't. In effect, that's what happens when it's a shift, but somehow the idea that the whole shift is the same, everybody who encounters the police on this shift versus another shift without cameras would be subject to the same conditions. But even so, this is a police force that had never done a randomized experiment before, and I'm sure it was a pretty surprising idea, if not shocking, when their police chief said, let's randomly assign these things to different shifts.
Yes, it certainly is a big ask when people are not familiar with this way of conducting a test or an experiment. How did Chief Farrar get his police to agree?
Well, he worked at it the same way I think any kind of major organizational change has to happen, with a lot of one-on-one conversation, a lot of answering of questions about this. The biggest question was, aren't you just going to keep these cameras anyway? And he had to assure them, no, this is an experiment. And if the facts don't support having these cameras, we're not going to keep these cameras. But if they do, then we will. It's not going to be based on Chief Tony Farrar's opinion. It's going to be based on the facts that are shared by the entire police department, because they work together to produce those facts with this randomized controlled experiment.
So tell us what happened next.
Well, the experiment was carried out as planned. The data on the complaints and force were collected. As soon as they started the experiment, the complaints dropped 90%, which meant that somehow the word got out that the cops are wearing cameras. So even when they weren't wearing cameras, people weren't making complaints about the police for some reason. It's possible police behavior changed. It's possible citizen behavior in filing complaints changed. But in science, we say what?
In science, we say a measure that controls for opportunity, as in every time there's a contact between police and the public, is a fairer measure than if you don't control for the amount of contact. So for example, you could have 2 police districts in Stockholm. One of them has a lot more complaints than the other, but that one also has a lot more encounters, either because there's more calls to the police or because the police take more opportunities to get out of the car and talk to people. And if those things are all measured well, as they are in Rialto, then you can track a very interesting question, which is not how many complaints does this unit have, or this team, or even this individual officer, but what is the rate of complaint per 1,000 contacts? Does anybody know if that rate is computed in Swedish Police? And, you know, to divide the number of complaints by the 1,000 contacts, so it's actually, if we take it down to the 0.07, you know, 1 complaint per 1,000 would be almost 10 times higher than that. So now we talk about 0.7 per 10,000 or 7 per 100,000. That's a pretty low rate if you think in absolute terms, that it takes 100,000 contacts with the citizens to have 7 complaints. But it may also be that if you were going to get interested in this question for whatever reason, whether it's the potential for tensions with police in different areas, you might want to compute it on that basis. So when we talk about the 3 Ts, this is testing, but it requires good tracking to have a good test. And good tracking isn't just the thing you're measuring, but it's conceiving of what the measure it should really be about. And if you want to have police have fewer contacts, you might get fewer complaints, but you also have less policing. And if you want more contacts, and you know that complaints will go up, then that is less painful if you know that the rate per 1,000 contacts is not going up. And so these are little things. These are not, you know, big life-changing events to think about it this way. But if you get tools like this embedded in everyday police decision-making, supervision, management, etc., it's fairer and more objective, and it can cumulatively make a big difference in how people feel about their work and how effective that work turns out to be.
What happened was that the effect of wearing the cameras on some shifts spilled over onto the shifts where they weren't wearing cameras. But still, there was enough use of force in encounters with the police so that for the entire year of the experiment, we could compare how often the police had to use force or did use force in encounters with the citizens when they had the cameras on compared to when they didn't have the cameras on.
So we know that in Rialto, there was a very big effect on both of these outcome measures we were interested in.
So the clearest experimental result was a 58% reduction in the use of force when the police were wearing cameras compared to the shifts in which they weren't wearing the cameras. The rates of use of force are pretty low to begin with. For every 100,000 contacts the police had with the public, there were 78 incidents in the use of force when they didn't have the cameras on. But putting the cameras on cut it down to only 33 incidents per 100,000 when the police were making these efforts to do normal police work. And whether that was because the citizens were less likely to resist when they knew they were being filmed, or the police were less likely to use force, we don't know. What we do know is that the result is a very clear reduction in something that causes so much friction between the police and the public, and that is when the police use force in carrying out their work.
So it's clear that the use of body-worn cameras in this one police force in the state of California had a huge impact. Did it have the same sort of news value elsewhere?
Well, actually, it really wasn't very big news anywhere until a New York Times story reported it on the back pages early in 2013. But it got into the record on the internet there. And then when the New York City Police Department was being sued for use of stop and search in inappropriate ways, the federal judge in that case decided to order the police to wear cameras. And for evidence to back up her decision, she cited the New York Times story on the Rialto experiment. The NYPD immediately denounced this requirement of the judge and said they were going to appeal it, which they later decided not to. But their initial reaction was that making the police wear cameras would create a dangerous situation for the police, and the court ordered them to do it anyway. There was massive publicity about this, lots of discussion about Rialto, and all of a sudden, this experiment became world famous almost overnight.
So Rialto became famous, and perhaps a bit of Cambridge as well.
Well, certainly it was surprising to people that it was a Cambridge University experiment that...
Yeah, but the key point is that once police officers started to wear cameras in the United States, they didn't want to take them off. We had a woman in Washington State who said she'd rather leave the police station without her gun than without her camera. So when we've tried to do experiments in other places now, the hardest thing is not to get them to wear the camera after the first week. Initially, they're reluctant to put it on. Once they put it on, then we say, okay, now you got a control group and you're not going to wear the camera. And they say, oh no, I'm going to wear my camera because, well, we've had quite a few police officers who did shoot somebody now in the United States, but with the camera on, they were cleared of homicide, criminal charges for the shooting. And if they hadn't had their camera on, they wouldn't have been cleared. The judges have actually said that it was the camera that cleared them. So it's certainly important for me to tell you that with the new experiments that have repeated Rialto, there's a very interesting finding about when you turn the cameras on and when you turn them off. And if the rule is, before you have an encounter with somebody, you turn on the camera at the beginning, and either the camera has a light on, or you say, I've got the camera going, or whatever, from the outset of the encounter, everybody knows it's being taped. Not every police officer was following that rule, and Dr. Ariel's findings now show that if they weren't in compliance with having the camera on for most of their encounters, what they tended to do was if the encounter got, tense, they would say, okay, I'm going to turn my camera on now. That was taken like a punch in the face because it was seen as aggressive in the context, whereas if they'd done it at the very beginning, it wouldn't have been aggressive. So these are more things that we learn about what works, what has what effects in terms of police decisions. The decision not to turn on the camera can be very dangerous for a police officer. So it's not just a matter of saying, here, take these cameras and go use them. It's a matter of understanding what we're doing when we're introducing technologies into these potentially dangerous situations that police officers are dealing with all the time. The biggest danger many of us are facing in modern life is excess consumption of sugar, leading to obesity and diabetes and premature death. So let me invite you out to have some cake. And then we will continue this discussion for those of you who can stay. That will resume in about 10 or 15 minutes as soon as we get all of the people lined up. And as far as I've been informed, there should be cake and caffeine right outside the door.